Hey folks, welcome to my overview video for the material from week one for this class. I'm just going to run through a couple of points that I think are really important. I'll start with U.S. society. I think. So if you didn't get a chance to watch the interview clip I did with Eric Olin Wright, I recommend watching it if you have a chance. I think he's an interesting guy. You don't need to watch the whole thing, but I do ask him a couple of questions about the way that the book itself is set up, with the idea being that authors have chosen to present a series of ideas that we maybe typically think are true and we don't really always think about critically, and then they present a set of arguments and data points to help challenge this sort of dominant or unquestioned view. And so the things that I'm really interested in about this first week of material are really these questions of capitalism and our economic system. And so these main questions about, what do we think capitalism is supposed to do as an economic system? And then in practice, as sociologists, how could we understand what's actually happening on the ground? The beginning of the book also sets up some really interesting dynamics about, what are we talking about if we're talking about American or U.S. society. I do have a bit of a problem with this notion of American society. Lots of people who are sociologists and anthropologists have critiqued this idea of America, as if we're all some cohesive group of people that hold together with the same values or the same ideals or the same cultural background. But I think at a minimum, even if we kind of critique that word, what does it mean to be an American, I think that maybe we can still find that there are some commonalities here about, what does it mean to live in the United States today? Do we, regardless of whether or not we could claim that there's some sort of shared, communal background that we all have, that there are still some of these values here. I think, ideals about freedom, ideals about efficiency, ideals about being prosperous that are driving some of the dilemmas that we might be having in our culture at the moment. That some of these notions of who should be prosperous, who should be free, are larger questions that we're grappling with, and that we see really becoming points of contention at this point around things like immigration, around racism, around a lot of different dynamics that we're sort of seeing unfold right now. But at a minimum, I think the book is trying to get us to see, here are some of these ideals that hold together as sort of particularly U.S. Notions. So I think that those are a good thing to situate and frame ourselves in this discussion. But I do really like that what they're trying to do here is give us an understanding of, despite what we might think about the role of the United States as this global superpower, there are some really specific ways that the United States is not necessarily doing as great as we would think it might be doing, right? We have some real dilemmas in terms of wealth inequality. We have a lot of problems when it comes to education and employment. We aren't necessarily doing great when it comes to health outcomes. We aren't doing a great job in a lot of different respects. So this kinds of this first chapter or two tries to establish for us, okay, here's what you might have thought, but actually here's what's going on with these huge, very powerful corporations that continuing to weaken role of workers in this dialogue or this discussion about the economy, and increasingly this liberalization and globalization of trade. So I just want to call your attention to some of those broad overviews in that first, this first chapter, that are just trying to give you a sense of okay, here's how we could characterize U.S. society. But for the most part, I really want to dig deeper into these questions about capitalism. So the first part of these chapters 3 and 4 here are really trying to say, okay, the capitalist market, how is it supposed to work? And so there's all these assumptions that we often make about this. And so I think that at a minimum, what we're talking about with capitalism, how they define it and how I would define it if we were in class in person working this out, is that we're talking about a system that's oriented, an economic system oriented around market exchanges. That means we're selling things for money, we're trading things for money. We're not bartering, we're not enslaving people to a huge degree the way we might have done in the 1800s, right? We're really thinking about things as there's a market and there's a marketplace in which goods and services are exchanged. The other characteristics of capitalism that they talk about as being important here are that we have the means of production. So that's all the stuff it takes to make something. Think about the land or the materials or the factory that you would need to produce something. But the majority of those things are not collectively owned by people. The majority of those means of production are owned by people who are wealthier. They are capitalists. They have more power. They have more influence. They have more control. So we're not collectively sharing those things. We're not collectively sharing the means of production. And then at the same time, most people in a capitalist economic system are selling their labor, right? Most of us are going to work for a particular wage. Most of us are trading our labor in order to maintain our livelihoods. We are not, some of us might be, but most of us are probably not subsistence farmers, right? Growing all the food we need and then trading at the farmer's market for the other stuff we need. Most people are in some ways selling their labor. So those are characteristics of capitalism that are important, and those would differ from different kinds of economic systems like feudalism or socialism. So they give you a series of arguments. Why typically in the United States are we continuing to support this particular kind of economic arrangement? And so they talk about the fact that most people believe that this is the best way forward, the most moral way forward, or the fairest way for an economic system to be arranged. Many people continue to believe that this is the most efficient way of organizing an economic system, and that it's also most likely to create the kind of competition that would result in innovation or growth. So those are important reasons why we continue to maintain a capitalist economic system. But I think what Chapter 4 really tries to do for us is to say, okay, those might be rationales and reasons and why we talk about capitalism as being this important economic system, but really in effect, when we look at it in practice, when we take a peek at how it plays out on the ground, what we actually find is it's not necessarily very efficient. My favorite examples of this are in the healthcare chapter, which we'll get to, I think, next week. But I think there's a lot of different ways that inefficiencies are built into a capitalist economic system. There's also not necessarily any guarantee that capitalism is going to create innovation or encourage people to take more financial risks. In fact, we could just look around at conglomerates of internet providers, right? Nobody's fighting to try and give us the fastest, best internet when we start to see the proliferation of just one or two of these becoming huger and huger. It's a terrible explanation, but you get what I'm saying here, right? There's not that much room for different kinds of innovation in the system that's dominated by a Comcast or a CenturyLink. The kind of smaller key players don't necessarily have a chance. So that could potentially be stifling innovation. There's also, oftentimes a reluctance to think that the federal government or any kind of government structures would have a capacity to regulate or to control capitalism, and that any intervention from state structures would be problematic from an economic standpoint. But what we actually see is that the government is constantly interfering with the economic system, and it's still functioning. So some of our assumptions about we need less and less regulation, we need more hands-off government, has not really been borne out when we look at the ways in which we're actively intervening into the economic system. You can think about the financial crisis in 2008 where we bail out the banks, but you can also think about, I think a great example is somewhere in Wright and Rogers, they talk about military contracts, that one of the largest expenditures of our federal government is on contracts to big corporations to build us weapons, to build us tanks and stuff that we need to wage wars, and that is a really huge intervention into the economy, that lots and lots of people are employed by Lockheed Martin, by these big, corporations that are building military equipment. And so that in turn is one way we're already intervening in the economy. By choosing to have a certain size military, we by default are then going to have to intervene by creating or giving military contracts to certain kinds of corporations. So it's a really interesting way to think about how different choices at a political level mean different economic circumstances happen. The book also talks about externalities. These, I think, are just briefly the unintended consequences of economic practice. Sometimes they can be good, so they don't have to be negative, but most of the time as sociologists we focus on the negative externalities because we're concerned that, well, if the economic system is, focused on making the most amount of money, what happens? Where do people cut corners? Where might there be health or environmental consequences here? So I really like some of the examples, and in the lecture I tried to give you some of my favorite examples. The Ford Pinto, right? That the Ford Motor folk decided when they were manufacturing the car that the trade-offs between, actually having to pay for one particular safety upgrade were not necessarily, they kind of did a cost-benefit analysis. One or two people could potentially be killed if we don't do the safety upgrade, but we'll also lose $5 million if we make that safety upgrade. And I'm fudging all the numbers there. You have to watch the PBS video. But, that's a really interesting example to think about how many times corporations are making those cost-benefit analysis, but that the outcome is that people pay the consequence there. So I'm an environmental sociologist, so I'm always really interested in those consequences when they play out when it comes to health or the environment. Okay, so I want you to be thinking about this dichotomy that they've set up for you and to really be thinking, okay, what are we talking about? What are some of these characteristics of capitalism that we need to be thinking about? Why have we historically really defended and kind of pursued capitalism at all costs in the United States? And then what are Wright and Rogers trying to get us to understand? Like, where are there maybe holes in some of that analysis? Where might this economic system not necessarily be serving everybody very well? So those are the questions that are most important this week. And I would like to turn really quickly to Righteous Dopamine because you're going to be reading the introduction in the first chapter of this book. And just some suggestions as you read this. I know that the images can be graphic, but I think that they are trying to to put a face to some of the problems of homelessness and drug addiction and to really help to bring this to light. The book itself, I think, came out in 2009, and I think that it's even more important now maybe than it was when it first came out because we have so much of an ongoing drug injection crisis, so much of an opioid epidemic as we're talking about it at this point. And I think this helps to shed light on some of the economic conditions and some of the particularities around race and gender as to why people or how people fall into the practices of using drugs and kind of that process or that transition by which people go from having a job and being employed and having a family to ending up being homeless. I think that there's really important ways in which we can and should be connecting this up to these larger economic questions that Wright and Rogers present to us. I think that the book itself gives you lots of theoretical ideas to think about, but I really love these questions about neoliberalism. I explained in some of the slides, PowerPoint slides this week, these ideas about neoliberalism. It's our political and economic system that we're currently practicing that really defends capitalism at all costs. And I think we can see if you take a peek at some of the more theoretical discussions in the book that the capitalist economic system is creating and constraining people's lives in certain ways that makes drug use and homelessness kind of not inevitable, but these not necessarily unexpected byproducts of this system. That when there's not a lot of jobs for people who don't have really high levels of education, it's likely that people could fall into this path. So it gives us a lot of kind of economic understandings of, well, what's the context in this part of San Francisco at the time that these folks end up transitioning into homelessness. There's not a lot of jobs, housing prices are increasing. There's not a lot of affordable healthcare options out there. So there's all these different ways that you can see that yes, there's some individual choices that are being made here by folks, but that the larger economic and political system is part of that environment in which people's choices remain limited or in which these options become viable to people. So I really want you to do the best that you can to make some connections between Righteous Dopamine and U.S. society, how it really works. Because I think that there's a lot of connections this week. That was my official voice. But for the most part, I encourage you to, as I note in those slides and the PowerPoint lecture, to if this is a environment or a context that drug addiction or homelessness are not things you're familiar with, to allow yourself to embrace what's going on here, to express that sociological imagination, to kind of see what it's like to be somebody else and walk in these people's shoes, and to do it in as respectful a way as possible, especially if it's something you haven't really encountered before. Okay, so with that, I just want to encourage you again to complete all the readings, do the quiz that's on Wednesday night, the quiz that's on Sunday nights, and to respond to the reading prompt for this first week with a paper by the end of the day on Sunday. All right, you can do this. If you have any questions, please drop me an email. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.